Have you lost your mind? That's the assignment I've been given to address in this message. And one thing I had lost up until a couple of minutes ago was the Jolly Green Giant. I've been looking all over for him. How many of you remember the Jolly Green Giant? Ho, ho, ho. Way to go. But Vesta just informed me that she found him, so things are good. We've got the giant, and all we have to do is find a way to recover our minds. Before we do that, let me just have another brief word of prayer. Our Father and our God, we are yours. We are yours with our hearts, our souls, our wills, our minds. And we ask that in this time of thinking, that you would refresh us in every dimension of our humanity. That when we leave here, we will leave with a deeper understanding of who you are and of who we are and how we can serve you more faithfully. For we ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. I've said, I think, many times that we are living in the most anti-intellectual climate in the history of the Christian church. And what I mean by anti-intellectual is not anti-academic or anti-technical or anti-scientific, but anti-intellectual, meaning anti the intellect, anti the mind. There's been an avalanche of criticism resulting in a wholesale rejection of the significance of the mind in living, particularly in Christian living, and God forbid, even within the church. And so what I'd like to do in this opening address of this conference is to look at the relationship of the mind to our bodies, firstly, and then look at the relationship between our minds to our wills, and then thirdly, the relationship between our minds and our hearts. And so let me start at the first step by looking at the relationship between the mind and the body. And to begin that, I need your help. I'm going to ask you to do something in just a moment, but I want to assure you and comfort you that what I'm asking you to do is not to make a commitment to anything or to volunteer for anything, or even to do anything of any substance. Simply, what I'm asking you to do, if you will, is raise your right hand. Now keep it up there. I want you to look around and see how many people have responded to this simple request of raising their right hand. I just wanted to see what was wrong. I thought maybe I was going too fast here. Some of you couldn't get it. All right, you can put those hands down now. Now, what just happened in the last few seconds demonstrates and illustrates one of the most mysterious phenomena that we ever encounter as thinkers and inquirers into reality. I asked you a question, I gave you a suggestion, in a word, I gave you a piece of my mind. And I was hoping that with your minds, you would understand the request that I made of you. And that so many of you responded to that request by actually raising your right hand gave me some assurance, at least, that you had at least a basic understanding of what I was asking you to do. But what is even more significant, that is, having understood my request in your minds, you responded with a physical, bodily reaction. You had a thought, which I tried to convey to you, mind to mind, an idea about raising your hand, and without coercion and without any difficulty whatsoever, you raised your hand. Now, how about that? I mean, isn't that incredible? And now I know what you're thinking. Has he lost his mind that he would give any significance to that? But that question involves the question of the relationship of the mind to the body. How an idea which is non-physical or mental can give rise to a physical action which is something material. We're talking about the way in which the non-physical relates to the physical. The mental relates to the material. Well, we're asking the question now of the relationship of mind to matter. Now, in our day, it has been said that the last frontier of scientific research and investigation is into the phenomenon of the mind. How the mind functions, how the mind works, where its power comes from. In the second half of the 20th century, we were treated or mistreated, however you look at it, to the school of behaviorism that tried to reduce all mental activity, all thinking, all thought to mere physical, material reactions. You may remember the work of B.F. Skinner, who wrote the well-known book entitled Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And in that work, he tried to argue, he didn't just try to, he argued that our idea of freedom is really an illusion, as also is our concept of dignity, because we are simply determined masses of matter who have no freedom whatsoever, but must believe what we believe according to what we have eaten or according to the physical impulses that have been around us through our lives. And so that even the conclusions we come to in our thinking have been rigidly determined by these material forces. You follow that? Am I going too fast? Now you get that, of course. Now, this is one of these cases where a man's argument falls by his own weight. Because here's a man who said he believes that every idea that you have, every thought that you conceive, every position that you espouse is not the result of free intellectual investigation, but simply the result of how many donuts you had for breakfast or what other material causes have operated on you. And yet, as he tries to argue that your thoughts are simply the results of material determinism, he actually tries to argue that your thoughts are only the result of material determinism, and he's trying to change my mind by what he perceives to be cogent arguments. And I would say to Mr. Skinner, I can't help what I believe. I can't help that I disagree with you with everything in my being because I had a glazed donut this morning. Other critics have put it this way against B.F. Skinner, that the only thing beyond freedom and dignity are slavery and indignity. So that the idea that we are more than materially determined objects and that there is such a reality as thought that is not materialistically controlled is an idea that is absolutely critical and essential to our Christian experience and to our lives as human beings. The mind is not material. We associate the mind with the function of the brain. The brain is material. The brain can be weighed and measured. The brain does take up space. But we still must distinguish between the thoughts that we have and the organ in our physical body that is related to them. That's most critical, for example, for the Christian, who at the heart of our faith is the affirmation that when we die and this earthly tabernacle dissolves and the brain deteriorates into the dust, that we continue to have a conscious, awake, personal identity that goes forever. I could ask you the question in another way: where do you live? I've asked my students that in the past when they introduce themselves. I'll say, where do you live? And they say, well, I live in Abilene, Texas. And I say, well, that's interesting. They say, why? I said, do you have the attribute of ubiquity or omnipresence? And they look at me strange. They say, what do you mean? I said, well, you tell me that you live in Abilene, Texas, and here you are in Orlando, Florida. Are you not alive now? If your life is contained in Abilene and you're not in Abilene, you must be dead. And they said, no. What I meant by that is my residence is in Abilene. I said, yes, that's what you mean. But where do you actually live? You live wherever you are. And even wherever you are, you live contained within the boundaries of your physical body, which to some degree identifies who you are. But if you really want to know who I am, and you want to know who you are, we have to do more than give a police sketch of your physical characteristics or to look at your medical records. To know who you are requires getting into the mind, because the chief place where we live is in our minds, in our thoughts, in our thinking. Well, again, what's the difference between our bodies and our minds? I had a professor once who was asked the question of the difference between our bodies and our minds, and he said, what is mind? No matter. Well, what is matter? He said, never mind. And with that cute little repartee, he was trying to explain to us that we must never, ever, ever confuse the material and the mental. Those of you who are students of the history of theoretical thought know that in the 17th century, in the world of philosophy, the relationship of the mind to the body was one of the most penetrating and compelling questions that occupied the investigation of the great philosophers of that period. I'm thinking initially of the mathematician slash philosopher Rene Descartes, who's famous for his formula, I think, therefore I am. Nevertheless, went beyond that formula and was asking the very question I've been asking: how can a non-physical reality, a thought, produce a physical reality such as raising your hand? And vice versa. If when I raise my hand, you slap it, that might provoke some thinking in my mind about you for having injured me in that manner. And so Descartes wrestled, bringing all of the power of his own mind to the question. And he said we see two categories, the mind and the body. And he said the body, or anything that is material, has what he called extension. Extension. That is, it has something that takes up space and can be measured. And that's true of all of us with respect to our bodies. We all have extension. Some of us have more extension than others, and sometimes we have more extension than we would like to have. But he said, unlike the body, the mind is not extended. A thought cannot be put on a scale. It can't be weighed. You can't use a ruler to measure it. And so he defined the difference between mind and matter as the difference between extension with respect to matter and non-extension with respect to the mind. And then proceeded to his investigation, saying, well, how can the extended give rise to extension? How can the extension or the extended give rise to non-extension? How does that happen? And he developed a somewhat complex theory that he called interactionism. You know, sometimes we think we've explained things by simply describing them. It doesn't necessarily explain anything. I mean, it's obvious to him at the outset of his investigation that there was some kind of interaction between thinking and action. And then he proceeded to give his theory that the point of transition between thought and action and thought was in the pineal gland, up in the brain, and he said that the transition took place at a point. Now he was relying on his mathematical knowledge. He said, because a point is something that takes up space but has no dimension. And so he played with that theory. His disciples came along and said, no, there's not enough God in this theory. We have to see that God is actively involved in everything that takes place in this world, including our thinking. And they were trying to look out for people who were already trying to remove God from the framework of human agency and activity and to get rid of the whole idea of God's providence by which he rules his creation. And a distinction was made then in the 17th century that made its way into our Reformed creeds and confessions that were very important. A distinction between primary and secondary causality. I've illustrated this at earlier conferences, and I'm going to do it again now with a very deep and profound and difficult illustration, so you're going to have to concentrate now intensely if you want to get this. These are my glasses. Am I going too fast? You got that? Okay. Now, watch what I do, and you will see that at no point does my hand ever leave my wrist? Okay, careful. I just dropped them. What caused that? Well, the atheist would say there was only one causal agent involved in that: me. R.C. Sproul made the glasses fall down on the table. Yet the Bible tells us that in Him, that is in God, we live and move and have our being. That I can't move, even from the lectern here, without the ultimate power of God energizing that activity. I can't live for a second without the upholding power of our sustaining providence of the God who created us in the first place. I can't be independent from God's eternal being. And so what the Bible is saying there is that the primary cause for everything that takes place in this world is God Himself. That whatever power I introduce to the equation is always and everywhere secondary. It's not the ultimate or the primary cause.